Hi, my name is Rachel and I'm one of the geography teachers at Woking College. We're really sad that we can't welcome you in person and give you a taste today, but hopefully this session will give you a little bit of a feel of what it's like to do geography at A level at Woking. So, why study geography? Geography is a varied, dynamic subject that broadcasts not just a lot of knowledge, but a lot of skills as well. Numerical skills, data, math skills, written, extended writing, essay skills. It's a facilitating subject for universities, and basically what that means is that universities like it. They recognise that a geography A-level is broad, that it gives you skills that is applicable to whatever it is that you decide to do, whether that is geography or whether that's something completely different after college. Geography is the second most employable degree, according to The Guardian, and that is because of its incredible skills and knowledge that you will gain from a qualification in it. And field trips. Field trips are the thing that is unique and specific to geography. It's what the subject is based on. In the first year, we go on 3 field trips. One to the coast to investigate coastal processes, one to London South Bank to look at place and the characteristics of place, and then one to Tooting to look at the impacts of migration. And it just gives you an opportunity to see the geography outside of the classroom and to engage with it in a slightly different way. And then finally, we study geography to understand the systems that affect our everyday life, whether that is the Earth-Sun relationship that controls our climate and weather systems, whether it's how these things are changing over time with the threat of climate change. We understand international relationships and policies that determine trade and migration links, all of those things that, whether we know it or not, determine the choices that we make every day. We get to study them at A level in geography. So what do we actually study? Well, we do a physical paper, a human paper, and then something called a debates paper, which draws physical and human together. Some of the things we study are familiar to you. So coasts you probably would have done before, looking at different landscapes, looking at processes and how they change over time. And then we do something called Earth's life support systems. So our carbon and water cycle, how they regulate the systems in our planet, but how we are altering them for good and bad ways. In paper 2, we look at the human units. We look at changing places, making spaces, the different characteristics of what makes a place and how that changes over time. We look at migration, the flows of people, and we look at human rights. Why is it that in some countries people don't have the right to vote? They don't have a right to education. Capital punishment is still enforceable by law, and in other places we don't have that. And what is the impact of that globally? Paper 3 is where we look at how our human and our physical geography interrelate and connect to one another. So we look at the hazardous earth, tectonics, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and then we look at disease. We look at how health is different around the world. We look at obesity, we look at pandemics, we look at a whole range of different health indicators and the geographical spread and patterns that follow them. And finally, the last part of the course is doing an independent piece of coursework. And the students love this because they get to pick a bit of geography that they love the most and spend a term researching it, answering questions, and coming up with some analysis. We help you and support you along the way, whether it's with formulating the questions or conducting the methods and then writing it up in the end to come to some really interesting conclusions. So for this taster session, we are going to look at those links between the physical and the human geography. We're going to look at how our health geography with the current coronavirus links to our carbon cycle, which is our physical geography. So what is the link between the global pandemic and the carbon cycle? Well, if we have a look at this graph, we can see where there have been international crises, whether it is economic depression or world wars, and more recently, the global coronavirus pandemic. We see that whenever we have these crises, we see a drop in carbon in the atmosphere. The International Agency says that as much as 2.6 billion metric tons of CO2, so approximately 8% of total emissions for the year, will not and has not been emitted into the atmosphere because of the lockdowns that have been enforced by national governments. So why has coronavirus reduced emissions? I'm going to give you a minute to think. If you want to pause the video, then you can, but write down some ideas. Why is it that these lockdowns have reduced emissions? So hopefully you've been able to think of a few ideas. You may have thought of some ones that I haven't, but the ones that I've thought of are people working from home. If we're working from home, we're not driving our cars, we're not commuting, and therefore fossil fuels aren't being combusted and released into the atmosphere. You might have had that social distancing means that factories are having to close, factories release harmful chemicals into our atmosphere, and that's no longer happening to the same extent. We've had a dramatic slowdown of that. We've also not been able to travel. We've had closed borders, and what that means is that we have less planes, less trains, less cars going into different countries, whether that is for work, whether that's for leisure or for trade. Less CO2 is being emitted because of those things. And finally, as people are furloughed, people lose their jobs, there's an economic impact there. But it means we have less income, and if we have less income, we can't afford to buy as many goods, and all of the goods that we buy have a carbon footprint attached to them. If we can't buy them, companies are making less of them, and therefore less CO2 is being emitted. So what is the evidence then of the link between the coronavirus and the carbon cycle? If we look at this map of China, we can see what the NO2 output was into the atmosphere in January, just before any lockdowns. Extremely high in northern China, where we see cities like Beijing that are incredibly industrial. Then if we jump forward a month, in the middle of lockdown, we see hardly any of this NO2 in our atmosphere at all, proving that when we have lockdowns because of these global pandemics, that we see a reduction in carbon in our atmosphere. And this trend has continued for the first 4 months. We see a very similar picture here, January and February, high NO2 and then a dramatic reduction. And as lockdowns have been lifted in early and late March, we see an increase of NO2 in both March and April, but not to the same extent as pre-lockdown levels. So what is the impact then of this changing in our carbon cycle? In today's world, we operate in something called a positive carbon feedback loop. And essentially that means that the carbon cycle is in this out of control snowball effect, that things are getting worse and worse and moving away from what they previously were. So for example, temperatures rise because more CO2 is being pushed into the atmosphere through burning of fossil fuels. This means we see an enhanced greenhouse gas effect because all of this CO2 is being trapped, or is trapping solar radiation. And as a result of this increased heat, this prompts forest fires and our melting ice sheets, and all of those things release carbon back into the atmosphere. And as a result of more carbon in the atmosphere, we see temperatures rise even further, enhancing the greenhouse gas effect even more forest fires and ice melting, releasing CO2. And it goes round and round and round, just like a snowball. But the argument is that with this pandemic, we are seeing less CO2 pushed into the atmosphere, and so that's going to change this snowball. A reduction in emissions would reduce fossil fuel usage and help our planet regulate itself. And so essentially what that means is that part of that cycle is being taken out, which is then going to impact the next stage in the cycle, and then the next one. And so we return to that normal cycling of carbon, which should be a good thing. And that's where we have our negative feedback loop occurring, reducing the effects of global warming and climate change. And so, we've talked a little bit about environmental impacts with our carbon cycle, but our carbon cycle also has social and economic and political impacts as well. And so what I'd like you to do now is to watch a video, and on your sheet of paper to divide it into two to create a table. One that says the benefits to the carbon cycle, people and place as a result of the pandemic, and one that's the negatives to the carbon cycle. And as you watch the video, identify these benefits and these negatives and place them in the correct bit of your table.
As coronavirus quickly spreads around the world, it's forcing people to stay put and wreaking havoc on the economy. Employees are either out of As coronavirus quickly spreads around the world, it's forcing people to stay put and wreaking havoc on the economy. Employees are either out of a job or working from home. Factories are shuttering, and with mandates to stay inside becoming the new norm, people aren't driving or flying. Given this, Stanford Earth Systems professor Marshall Burke raised an interesting question.
Ignoring for a moment all the terrible disruption happening from the virus itself, what might be the air pollution benefits, if you will, of this economic slowdown?
Massive, it turns out. The World Health Organization estimates that outdoor air pollution kills 4.2 million people every year. Over 1 million of these deaths occur in China. But as people stay home, these last 2 months have seen a huge uptick in air quality, especially in hard-hit cities like Wuhan, as well as in northern Italy and a number of metropolitan areas throughout the U.S. By Burke's most conservative estimate, this change has saved 50,000 lives in China. To be clear, nobody is saying that the outbreak is good. It's undeniably quite bad for our physical, mental, and financial well-being. It's also very likely bad for climate change overall, as priorities and funding are now shifting towards public health, as they should. But it's also undeniable that this reduction in carbon emissions has had a huge impact.
Our estimates are that just 2 months of improved air quality reduced the number of lives lost by 50,000. These are deaths that would have happened otherwise that did not, or were at least happened much later than they would have.
As of late March, there were over 25,000 coronavirus deaths worldwide, though this number doesn't tell the whole story.
This does not count the many other deaths that we will likely observe due to the economic disruption, due to congestion in the healthcare system, people with non-COVID-19 diseases not being able to get the care that they would need otherwise. I think we should not think of this as a cost-benefit calculation around epidemics. The cost of this epidemic is going to be massive, the economic cost, the health cost, the social cost.
But scientists like Burke hope that by talking about the lives saved from cleaner air, they can raise awareness about just how dangerous more subtle, insidious threats like air pollution can be. And then once the virus is contained, maybe some positive mindsets and habits will arise from the disruption.
So I hope people are recognizing that there are different ways to live. We might not need as much as we thought we needed.
The take is absolutely not that there is a silver lining to epidemics. Epidemics are terrible, but maybe they help us also learn about things we do in our everyday lives that could be improved.
It can be shocking to realize that millions die every year from bad air. Because unlike a pandemic, smog and soot are slow killers. The effects build over time until an individual eventually dies from cardiovascular or respiratory distress.
You're exposed to air pollution over years and decades. Whereas with the coronavirus, the impacts are almost immediate, a matter of days, not even weeks.
What's more, air pollution is an old problem. Even centuries ago, burning wood, burning coal, and smelting for lead and copper extraction was poisoning our ancestors' air.
The very first air quality legislation was enacted by King Edward of England in the 1300s. So we've just learned to live with air pollution for a very long time. Does that mean it's okay? Absolutely not. Air pollution is terrible, it's dangerous, it disproportionately kills the youngest and the oldest, the sick and the infirm, the poorest and most vulnerable people.
And Chinese cities have some of the worst air in the world, according to a measurement of particulate matter called PM 2.5, which is the most dangerous type of pollutant. The 2.5 refers to the particulate size, 2.5 microns, or about 1/30th the width of a human hair.
The baseline levels of PM 2.5 in many Chinese cities are above 100, and that's measured in micrograms per cubic meter. So for comparison, most places in the US have average PM 2.5 levels below 10. So you can think of Chinese levels as often being 10 times worse on average.
Some Italian cities, like Milan, face similar concerns. In the wintertime, PM 2.5 levels in Milan regularly exceed 100. And this January, before the lockdowns, there were 14 days where levels exceeded 150. After the Chinese economy ground to a halt, PM 2.5 levels rapidly decreased by about 20%. Satellite images from NASA reveal proof of this significant drop in China, as well as in Italy, now considered the center of the global crisis. Major U.S. cities like Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York are also seeing major shifts, with researchers at Columbia University calculating that carbon monoxide emissions in New York City are down by over 50%. One unexpected effect of this rapid shutdown has been that Venice's typically murky canals are running clear for the first time in years, as boats are no longer kicking up sediment from the ground. This doesn't necessarily indicate that the water quality has improved, but it still served as a powerful reminder to many of what our cities would look like without tourism. Air quality, though, has undoubtedly improved, and while there's no data yet on how many Italian lives this has saved, it's likely significant. The country has some of the worst air pollution in the European Union, leading to over 60,000 deaths per year. In the US, where about 200,000 people die from air pollution yearly, an unknown number of lives are also being spared. In the case of China, Burke was able to arrive at his estimate for lives saved by extrapolating on data gathered during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. During this time, the Chinese government undertook a massive effort to clean up the air, shutting down factories and power plants and keeping cars off the roads.
And this led to about a 25% improvement in air quality in Beijing over about a 2-month period. So it's almost the exact same case in terms of the air quality changes as we have seen in China over the last few months. Under conservative estimates, I calculate that this 2-month improvement in air quality saved about 50,000 lives.
Clearly, though, nobody hoped that this was the way emissions reductions would come about.
It's exactly the wrong way how we should go about decreasing emissions. It's not about going back into our caves. Really, what ought to happen for climate change is thinking hard about deploying new technologies, deploying existing technologies at scale, figuring out how to decrease emissions without what is currently happening, right? Without crashing economies, millions of people out of work, millions of lives destroyed.
As soon as the pandemic and the emergency passes, it's likely that industrial production will ramp right back up again, possibly to much higher levels than it was before to make up for the gap. But what I do hope is that we'll see that there is a different way to live.
For example, this period of remote working and video conferencing could urge people to rethink their need to travel frequently.
Even eliminating a few business trips and doing them remotely eliminates a huge proportion of my own personal carbon footprint. And I think my experience with the technology in the last few weeks suggests that I should absolutely be doing that. There's no reason to not do that.
And perhaps quantifying the benefits of cleaner air could help drive the adoption and enforcement of stricter emission standards for industrial plants such as steel mills, a major contributor of pollutants in China.
It really highlights the overall health burden of our everyday actions, our sort of business as usual economies. So I agree that it would be great if we approach those problems with something like the same focus that we're now approaching the epidemic.
While emissions are down, the coronavirus outbreak will undoubtedly hurt the greater fight against climate change in a number of other ways.
Some of the places that are being impacted most severely, for example, in China, manufacture solar panels. They're a large part of why solar panels are now in many places cheaper than coal, and how we can actually say that a clean energy transition is possible.
China is also a major manufacturer of wind turbines and lithium-ion batteries, which power electric vehicles and provide energy storage. Coronavirus-related supply chain disruptions could massively impact the price and availability of green tech. And as the global economy enters a downturn, funding for clean energy initiatives may dry up.
A lot of effort and funding that could be going to climate adaptation and resilience and mitigation could be diverted to dealing with this pandemic because it is so urgent and we do need to address it.
While scientists would like to address all of our problems at once, a crisis of this magnitude means priorities will inevitably shift.
Yes, we should be able to walk and chew at the same time. But frankly, yes, when you are sprinting, I think you ought to focus on the finish.
So, you've watched the video and hopefully have a few ideas of what the benefits and negatives are of the coronavirus on our carbon cycle. Maybe you have some of the benefits listed here. Less people dying from air pollution, a social benefit then. Building positive habits as we're reducing our consumption. There's been a 50% reduction in atmospheric CO2 in New York. That's absolutely humongous. Cleaner waters in Venice. And a long-term shift to remote working, as people realise they can work from home, might mean that in the long term we see less CO2 in our atmosphere from transport. But the negatives here are that the international focus has moved away from climate. We had massive climate summits and international meetings to try and address climate change that now have shifted their focus. They're now focused on health and tackling the coronavirus and helping their economies recover. They're devoting funding to those things rather than the climate, which they were thinking about doing a year ago. As much as we're building positive habits to help the environment, it is hard to undo these habits. We've lived with them for years. Changing our way of life will not be easy. As one of the professors argued, reducing emissions isn't always viable economically. It costs a lot of money to do it. And so what we're going to have to think of is actually creating new technologies, not necessarily reducing the amount we consume. And the final negative is that we are disrupting our supply chain. As this coronavirus is stopping factories from producing goods, it's stopping the production of solar panels, of wind turbines, and all of these things were supposed to help our climate change issue. But if we're not making solar panels anymore because factories are changing, then we aren't going to be able to stop our changing carbon cycle and climate change. So that leads us to our final question. Will the reduction in emissions because of these lockdowns impact climate change? If we have a look at this table, it tells us a range of different greenhouse gases that all have carbon in them. It tells us how much of those gases was in the atmosphere before and after Industrial Revolution. And then importantly, it tells us how long these gases stay in our atmosphere. And that's what we're interested in right now. And what it tells us is carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 50 to 200 years. And so what that means is that the reduction in the last 2 or 3 months of carbon in the atmosphere isn't really going to have any impact for at least 50 to 200 years. We can't evaluate the impact immediately. The short-term reduction of emissions itself is great, but the impact we won't be able to see for a long time to come. It will be a tiny blip in the overall trend, which shows that climate change is becoming more of a threat because we are releasing more carbon into the atmosphere. And this can be seen because even in the last 3 months where we've been reducing our carbon emissions massively, as seen in that video, we have seen the highest Arctic temperatures on record. So despite global reduction in emissions, that has coincided with warmer temperatures in the coldest parts of our planet. This is a problem that needs addressing, and hopefully governments can come together, local people can change the way they live to continue to reduce carbon emissions, and in the long term this will have an impact on our environment, on slowing down carbon change and reducing risks associated with it. So that is the end of our taster session today. Hopefully I will see you in September. If you have any questions, then please drop me an email, but we look forward to seeing you.